Hundreds killed in Gaza hospital blast. President Biden arrives in Israel. And how much will the state pension rise next year? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Labour MP Rosanna Allen Khan, Conservative MP Tim Lawton, journalist and columnist for The New European Paul Mason, and The Sun on Sunday's political editor Kate Ferguson. On today's programme, a huge bomb blast at a Gaza hospital kills hundreds of people. Israelis and Palestinians blame each other for the devastation.
Everybody is so angry at this deliberate war crime that Israel conducted.
They understood with absolute certainty that it was a rocket misfired by Islamic Jihad.
The US president arrives in Israel amidst the deepening crisis. What can he achieve? It's Prime Minister's Questions at noon. There's likely to be unity on the Israel-Gaza war, but not everyone in the Labour Party is happy with Keir Starmer's position. We'll ask this councillor why she's resigned from the Labour Party. And calling out misinformation or curtailing free speech, Rishi Sunak is warned over censorship. Let's start with the escalating crisis in Israel and Gaza, starting today with that devastating blast at a hospital in Gaza City. Hundreds of people were killed. Many of them were sheltering in the hospital. Hamas, which runs Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, which is in charge of the West Bank, and many Arab leaders have blamed Israel for the attack. And these are pictures from the aftermath of the blast. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been injured. While the Israeli Defense Force has categorically denied they are responsible, they've said it was a misfired rocket launched by Islamic Jihad from within Gaza. Well, flying into the eye of the storm, the US President Joe Biden, who arrived a little while ago on Air Force One in Tel Aviv to be greeted by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog. Meetings with Arab leaders, certainly public meetings face-to-face, have been cancelled. Let's look, though, at what Joe Biden said in a brief press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu.
I was deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you. But there's a lot of people out there not sure. So we've got to overcome a lot of things.
Well, let's talk to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, who's in southern Israel. Lise, picking up on Joe Biden's comments there, what do we know about the hospital blast and who was responsible?
Yes, this horrific explosion at the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza City. And on the horizon behind us, you can see the outlines of Gaza City, where there's been bombardment, Israeli bombardment throughout the morning. But last night was, in the words of Palestinian health officials, an unparalleled attack. And the scene of carnage and chaos was indescribable. So much loss of life that they have run out of body bags. And what started immediately was another vicious cycle of claim and counterclaim. This morning, Israel presented what it said was a credible case based on 5 hours of analysis of what had actually happened. He said the damage to the area, the park was mainly in the parking lot, he said, where hundreds of Palestinians had gone to take shelter in this war. He said that damage was not consistent with an airstrike. They emphasized that this was the result of a missile misfired by the Islamic Jihad group, a missile which then hit an ammunition dump close by, and that, according to Israel, is what caused all of the damage. They released a lot of what they say is evidence to back up their claim. audio intercepts, they say, of conversations between Hamas and Islamic Jihad leaders. The BBC is now trying to verify them, images of the scene. But as President Joe Biden said, there are others who not just aren't sure, he knows, they are convinced that whatever Israel says, there is absolutely no trust and there is deepening anger. They believe that this was, without doubt, an Israeli airstrike. And that is what we are hearing from Arab leaders across the region,
Yes.
including the United States' most closest allies. This, they say, was an Israeli war crime.
And that is the problem, isn't it? The level of mistrust now as this crisis goes on. President Biden's arrival is pivotal today, and of course it's been overshadowed by this horrendous hospital blast. What hope is there of any sort of diplomacy to try and de-escalate the situation?
President Biden has been watching up close the situation in this region for 50 years. He also believes in the power of his personal touch, face-to-face talking. Throughout his long political career, he has made it absolutely clear he is a friend of Israel. And that is what he said when he arrived today. He wanted to make clear which side he was on. And that statement was praised by Benjamin Netanyahu for President Biden's moral clarity. But as we know, when you are the closest of friends, you can ask the toughest of questions. They are now talking together behind closed doors, without cameras, and I think we can assume that there will be some very tough talking. President Biden has made it absolutely clear from the start that Israel has America's back. There's been a lot of military, financial, and moral support. In exchange, the United States wants to know that Israel will respect the laws of war, that it will minimize the harm to civilians, that it will do everything possible right now to get urgently needed aid into Gaza, where, according to the UN, there is epic suffering. That would be an achievement for him if he's able to leave Israel with a concrete commitment from Israel that it will allow aid into Gaza, even more that it would open that one exit in and out of Gaza at the southern crossing with Rafah to let foreign passport holders, Gazans with dual passports, including Americans, to leave and allow desperately needed food and fuel and medical supplies in. But that is a very big ask. And don't forget, there's also the issue of hostages. Nearly 200 hostages, and they include 30 nationalities, possibly British because some are still missing, and certainly it's been said that Americans too.
Lise Doucette in southern Israel, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. Let's talk to our guests here in the studio. President Biden is in Israel. It's possible that Rishi Sunak is going to visit the region in the coming days, but we know that public meetings with Arab leaders have been cancelled. There are protests right across the Arab world. What hopes do you think there are of a diplomatic or any diplomatic success?
Firstly, I think any comments need to be prefaced with the fact that the horrific terror attacks of around 10 days ago now were absolutely horrific, and our thoughts and prayers go out to the families, and we hope and pray that the hostages are returned safely. It is really important that Palestinian civilians do not pay the collective price for Israel understandably wanting to get those hostages back and defend herself. There needs to be an immediate de-escalation of the crisis. We are seeing thousands of innocent civilians losing their lives in Gaza. There is no access to clean water. People are having to drink seawater. There is no access to medicine. There is no access to fuel, electricity. All of these things are causing a humanitarian crisis of epic proportion. The UN are actually stating that their efforts are looking to fail and to crumble before our very eyes. So there absolutely has to be a concerted effort across all of the Arab nations and the Western world to come together with a priority to be protecting innocent civilians. Obviously, this is a very contentious issue on many sides. Obviously, people have very deep-held opinions on either side, but people have to fundamentally remember that at the heart of this, innocent people are dying.
I mean, one of the problems, Tim, is the issue of who is responsible for this blast. And it's contested, and some people have made up their minds. We can show you pictures of protests in many countries across the Arab world, even though Israel says it has this very plausible explanation for why it cannot be from the Israeli Defence Force. But with that going on, how can it be de-escalated when, as Rosanna is saying, thousands of civilians are just caught in the crossfire?
Well, I think Lee's words about the complete breakdown of trust is at the core of all this. That is the problem. It's become such a polarised situation that whatever somebody says they've done or doesn't, they will be challenged. I thought the President's use of the word "the other team" was not helpful. Frankly, and I agree with absolutely everything Rosanna's just said, that the only team we are really concerned about is those innocent civilians on either side of the border whose lives are under threat. And there has got to be a consolidated effort now to bring aid and the basics to those people in Gaza who are absolutely struggling to carry on and live their normal lives. The hostages must be released. The only glimmer of hope is the suggestion that Hamas has said that they might release the hostages if the missile strikes stop. I think that is absolutely something that should be seized on straight away. And then you can start talking about what happens next. Israel had every right to defend itself, and the atrocities that happened in Israel are on an altogether unparalleled scale. Israel has now made its point. More Palestinians have now been killed. Whoever you want to lay the blame at, it doesn't matter whether it was a stray Israeli missile or a stray or targeted Hamas or jihadi missile here. The fact is that several hundred people, innocent people by and large, have lost their lives, and that must be our biggest priority to what we do to help the people and the people around them, and to stop that happening again, because it can happen by accident. This is the problem. Well, we eventually find out who caused it, and we need to know that information to make sure it's not going to happen again. The problem is everyone is fearing that this is going to spread, that there is a bigger geopolitical battle going on that perhaps involves Iran and Iran's proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is to the north of Israel. We already have the issue of the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority is very weak and discredited, and Mahmoud Abbas has also cancelled face-to-face meetings. That makes it very, very perilous.
It's an incredibly perilous moment, and as someone who was there during the 2014 war in Gaza, I just want to say to viewers who don't understand, why do people cluster in the courtyard of hospitals? Because white people in helmets and flak jackets and doctors from Western aid organisations are there, and it's very unlikely, their calculation is, that the Israelis are going to hit it. That's why people go there. And I think that if we are looking at 500 casualties from what was a very small area actually hit by that, whatever it was, we have to understand that itself is a product of the way the war has been prosecuted so far. People have no idea where to go. That having been said, as you say, Rishi Sunak was right to call the 7th of October attack on Israel a pogrom. It was a racially motivated piece of mass murder. And its aim was to signal, not just to people in Israel, but to Jews here, this is what's going to happen to you. It was accompanied by a call for people all over the region to rise up and destroy the state of Israel. Now, in that situation, what we've got to, as we coolly look at it and think, well, what the hell do we do? We've got to understand that Hamas practiced 2 years of strategic deception to be able to do this. It said, we're making peace, we're not interested in fighting you. Does that mean that the Iranians also are thinking along those lines? If so, then those 2 aircraft carriers are not going to be, that the Americans have sent, are not just going to be sitting there idly standing by. That's the peril we're in. And I think that's why, if we can, as Rosin says, de-escalate, then I think whatever Israel finally decides to do about Hamas, all the wise voices are in not invading Gaza right now, because it will make last night seem minor by comparison. I mean,
there is this issue of where people go. The Israelis warned people, gave them 24 hours. It turned into a few days for Palestinians living in the north part of Gaza to flee southwards as they try to root out Hamas and retrieve these hostages. In fact, we can show you an example of one of the hostage families who have been affected. It's on the front page of The Sun. It says, inside horror house where Brit girl 13 was slain. The number of hostages taken by Hamas is significantly higher than first thought. Nearly 200 people being held, including children and old people. And yesterday it was confirmed in that story that British mum of two, Leanne, and her youngest daughter, Yael, were amongst those massacred by Hamas at a nearby kibbutz along the Gaza Strip, kibbutz Be'eri. Her eldest daughter and husband are now missing, feared dead or being held hostage. That is one example of the heightened sensitivities, fear, grief, pain being felt. But there is a responsibility on countries like Egypt to the south of the Gaza Strip to allow a humanitarian corridor for Palestinians to leave Gaza. But it is complicated for them too. That humanitarian point is probably now the focus of many politicians' minds, Kate.
Yeah, just to dwell for a moment on the story that you just highlighted in our paper today, in that front page. That's a story of one family whose children were slaughtered. And as you say, a pogrom, and it is just so heartbreaking, and it's worth spending a moment, I think, reading those individual stories and remembering what happened that night. In terms of the humanitarian effort, it's pretty clear that that's where diplomatically, internationally, things are moving now. Egypt will play a huge role in that, but clearly in those conversations behind the scene, Joe Biden is going to be appealing to Netanyahu to try and open up those humanitarian routes. There's a big question about whether or not he leaves today successful.
Right. Should Egypt now open that humanitarian corridor? Apparently, they are saying that they don't want to aid or abet displacement of Palestinians from Gaza on a permanent basis. They've got to worry about a large number of refugees being in Egypt for a very long time. But is it key in order to stop the blockade by Israel, as well, of course, discussion over hostages that are being held by Hamas in terms of helping people in Gaza?
I think it's self-evident that we have to persuade them to do so. There's only three ways in: the sea, the Israeli border, and the Egyptian border. What the Egyptians are worried about, and it's not just the Egyptians, are worried about in terms of, they're worried about the fact that we have a government in Israel that is a centre-right, far-right coalition, some of whose politicians will quite happily clear the Gazan Palestinians out. And the Palestinians of Gaza have been mobilised against this possibility since the 1950s when it was mooted. The Egyptians are saying, look, if they come, we'll only let them into a 6-kilometre area right in the middle of the desert by the border. We can't, that's not a solution either. And therefore, when we say these, I think the Egyptians must let supplies through. I think we want to persuade the Israelis to do so, but we need to realise that anybody in Israel who's then saying, right, now you can take 2 million Palestinians, that Joe Biden's got to be saying very clearly that is not an option.
Well, just focusing in on refugees, this headline in The Independent, we were covering Humza Yousaf, the First Minister of Scotland, leader of the SNP, his speech to conference yesterday. He said UK and rest of the world must create refugee scheme for people fleeing Gaza. He offered Scotland as the first place to take refugees from the Middle East. What's your response to that, Rosanna?
The priority has to be peace in the region. There has to be a two-state solution where everyone can live in peace. I have worked in the region.
It's a long way from that, isn't it?
I've worked in the region for 13 years. I wrote the entire quality improvement plan for all the healthcare systems and hospitals in the Lebanon for Palestinian refugees. I've worked in the West Bank. The way in which Palestinian refugees live is no life at all. To expect them to flee Gaza and go and sit in Egypt, sit where? Their homes are in Gaza. But it's really important to mention that the state of life within which they live to begin with is not a state that you and I would ever wish to live in and raise our children. The priority has to be humanitarian access. It has to be Israel turning on the water, allowing fuel supplies, allowing medicine to get through. It has to be everybody playing their part. And I would like to see humanitarian supplies going through Egypt, the Egyptian border. I would like to see everybody taking their collective responsibility to save civilian lives.
Now, is there going to be growing pressure on both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer? Of course, they're going to be at the dispatch box, or across the dispatch box in the House of Commons shortly. They've given unequivocal support for Israel and Israel's right to defend itself. But will that position come under pressure as the death toll mounts in Gaza?
Well, the principle of Israel's right to defend itself and to be a sovereign state is inalienable, and that shouldn't be challenged. But as a sovereign state, you have duties in international law and to abide by the laws of warfare as well.
Right.
Now, I think the world largely sided with Israel after the atrocities, which I said were on an altogether different scale of anything we've seen before against Israel. And so one understood why Israel felt it needed to, quite rightly, to respond. But it's got to be in a way that is proportionate and obeys the rules of law. Otherwise, it loses that moral high ground which it had. And those scales are getting close unless Israel starts to say, right, we will now help ameliorate the humanitarian crisis, which is clearly going on before our eyes. But they have some key objectives which they still need to achieve. The first of those is to secure the safe release of those hostages and to make sure that the minute they stop their offensive, Hamas doesn't start the rockets again, and we go back to where we started. There's also the whole issue about the tunnels under Gaza and everything, which have been used by terrorists for ages. They might want to clear those out. I don't think they need to have a full-scale invasion of Gaza to achieve those objectives, and then we can sit round and have an international discussion, which Egypt is absolutely a key part. And it's worrying that various leaders are not going to now sit down with Biden, because we need to have a conversation where everybody can play its part. There's an immediate emergency accommodation issue about those people that need to get out of Gaza, because Gaza is such a small place. But not on and it needs to be on a temporary basis, and all the aid agencies can go in and help their immediate needs, but on the basis they're going to be coming back to Gaza when it's safe to do, and the international community can help that reconstruction as well, safely for both Palestinians and Israelis.
Let me just show everyone this headline in the Daily Telegraph, and I'll get you to respond. Labour holds crisis talks amid grassroots rebellion over pro-Israel stance. Party bosses brace for flurry of resignations in Leicester that would see them surrender control of city for first time in 16 years. Do you share those concerns?
I think that this is such a painful issue on so many sides. And as leaders in our communities, as elected representatives, we are seeing a lot of pain from all angles. We have to understand that, and we have to be ready to listen and have constructive dialogue.
And Keir Starmer's been getting his language right over this.
He's been very clear. I was in the statement on Monday. He has been very clear that he wants to protect our Jewish community in this country, our Muslim community in this country, and that he wants humanitarian law to be upheld.
And it is difficult for community tensions here, potentially, as everyone tries to keep calm over what is happening in another part of the world.
Yes, and we can see, I think it's more apparent in the USA than it is here, that the systemic competitors, Russia and China, are using their bot networks, using their influence networks to stir things up as well. I think we all have a duty to try and calm things down, but we must understand why so many British Muslims are focused on this issue is, and I hear it again and again when I speak to them, it's the Israeli behaviour over the stewardship of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is one of the most holy places in Islam, which the Israeli government has allowed Jewish extremists to come into. Now, you can go to any doorstep in any constituency where Labour represents, and you will hear that issue raised. So I think one of the things that we need to do is ask our Israeli colleagues to be restrained on that and on what's happening in the West Bank. But when the headline says people are fed up with Keir Starmer over Labour's pro-Israeli stance. I mean, we've been absolutely clear. I mean, I'm a member of the Labour Party, a rank and file member. We've been absolutely clear that Israel has a right to defend itself against this attack, because the attack is not the same as everything else. I mean, it's had the right before. It's an absolutely new situation in the Middle East where we must have a genuine and logical fear that the next thing is a war between Israel and Hezbollah, and then come lobbying over the missiles from Tehran, and then the peace in the region will be over.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, because there's a kind of, people can drift into equivalence here. Israel is a democratic, sovereign state. Hamas are a terror organisation that wants to destroy it and kill all Jews. And that is the fundamental difference. And you talk about community tensions here, Joe. I thought it was appalling, some of the scenes we saw last weekend, and I thought it was shameful that Jewish schools in North London had to shut because of last Friday. I thought it was just deeply depressing, appalling, and a moment to actually recognise and consider.
And there is fear in the Jewish community.
I would like to say
who
something.
felt intimidated by a lot of that.
Yeah, and that is absolutely wholeheartedly wrong. No one in any community, and the Jewish community, should ever feel afraid or feel fearful. But I feel that it is my responsibility as a British Muslim with a Polish mother who lost a lot of her family in the Second World War in Poland to say that people must not mistake Muslims and the Muslim community and their support of the Palestinians as something of anti-Semitism. It is standing up and calling out the oppression of Palestinian people that's happened over many decades. And every single Muslim that I know, that I have spoken to, every community leader that I have spoken to, shares my disgust and outrage at what Hamas did. That is not acceptable, and that is un-Islamic. And that is really important to get on the record today.
It is difficult, though, for people watching all this unfold to be clear about Hamas and who they are and what they want to see in terms of obliterating Israel and in charge of Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip.
Well, Hamas is almost unique in that respect. They are the government of a country where they have no regard for the safety of the people they are governing. Yeah. They have put those Palestinians in Gaza between them and the Israelis, and that is absolutely disgraceful. How do you deal with a terrorist organisation that is a terrorist organisation officially? How do you deal with those sorts of mindsets? There's one thing that I thought was slightly encouraging when President Abbas the other day made a clear statement saying that Hamas do not represent Palestinians. They are nothing to do with us. It was a sort of almost a not in my name moment. And I would like to see many, many Palestinians, moderate Muslims around the world, coming forward and saying they are not doing this in my name. I think that will make things much easier, in the same respect that some Israelis will say that about their some of the excesses of their own government. The events of last night have made that much more difficult, and so we've seen people
and the mistrust that you spoke about,
and the whole mistrust. So people in the West Bank now have taken to the streets, where there was a glimmer of hope that perhaps they would say, Hamas nothing to do with us. We are moderates. Let's deal with the moderates around the world. Let's hope we can get back to that.
I think there will be a sombre mood at Prime Minister's questions, which we will, of course, be covering in just over 15 minutes' time. But before that, let's discuss this headline and this story in The Telegraph. Social media firms are silencing free speech with disinformation claims, Sunak told. Over 100 academics, historians and journalists have warned the Prime Minister against censoring free speech in a statement delivered to Number 10. Now, one of those who signed the document is author and journalist Laura Dodsworth. She joins us now. Why have you signed the letter, Laura?
Thanks for having me. Well, everyone who signed the letter is united in the belief in the importance of free speech and concerned about labelling speech misinformation and disinformation, because that has resulted in the censorship of people across professions and it's stifled debate and discussion. There's a worldwide battle against misinformation and hate speech, and in fact states and NGOs are acting in tandem to stifle dissent. Tech companies and governments have coordinated behind the scenes in order to censor people for lawfully held opinions and facts, as we saw with the Twitter files, and also Big Brother Watch's report into the Counter-Disinformation Unit. So we're asking governments to uphold their responsibility to their citizens to have the right to freedom of speech and opinion, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to tech companies to protect the digital modern public square, and asking people, all of the general public really, to promote an attitude of inquiry and debate and not to stand against a climate of intolerance and censorship.
Right, what examples have you got and are you referring to?
Sure. Well, I mean, one example last night would be the astonishing speed with which Hamas claimed that IDF bombed a hospital, and the speed with which mainstream media, and including the BBC, reported that as fact. Now, I'm sure you'd agree that the BBC shouldn't be prosecuted or lose its licence, but in fact that bad information should be met with good information.
All right. Any other examples?
That's one very timely example. Sure.
Yes.
Another example would be the Wuhan lab leak. So when it was originally suggested that COVID-19 might have escaped from a lab in Wuhan, that was called a conspiracy theory. And in fact, it was fact-checked numerous times around the world. Now it's considered plausible and likely. And in fact, we've seen emails released from public health scientists, including Sir Jeremy Farrar of the Wellcome Trust and SAGE in the UK, where they had private discussions where they talked about the likelihood, the possibility of the lab leak. And they conspired, in effect, to put forward the theory that it hadn't escaped from a lab.
All right.
Now, what that did was inhibit discussion and investigation, and it wasn't correct.
Okay.
So the way to build trust with people is to allow a free discussion about facts.
Okay.
More importantly,
I'm going to just stop you there,
than that,
Laura. I'll come back to you in a minute, but let me just open it up to our other guests here. Paul, on the principle, and particularly taking the Wuhan lab leak as an example, do you agree with Laura?
No, I just don't. I think that there was a phrase used in the 1930s, militant democracy. Democracy has to get militant in its own defence. Disinformation is being flooded into our societies to divide them, to make people angry, to almost degrade the quality of democracy. Now, if someone makes a mistake in an innocent way, I think they're usually able to correct themselves and happy to be corrected. If there are entire industrial scale installations pumping out disinformation, society-wide, we have to have a defence against it. Now, what this letter is about the tendency of social media firms to label disinfo. The only reason they're labelling is because they haven't got policies to actually cut it out. Right now, including last night, over this terrible tragedy, people on Twitter with blue checks and who monetize, that is, they get money for how many clicks they get, were coining it in, putting out absolutely false information. I want either Twitter or my government to defend me against that and to defend innocent 16-year-olds who might be watching it on their laptops, who have no idea that this stuff it could be wrong.
Right, Laura, what do you say?
Let me counter quickly with 5 points. First of all, free speech is important in a democracy, and attacks on free speech historically are precursors to attacks on other forms of liberty. Secondly, who fact-checks the fact-checkers? There's something that's known as the half-life of facts. Sorry, let me just continue with the points I want to make to counter what you said. These are rhetorical questions. I just want to get to the point. There's a half-life of facts and knowledge. It's shortened drastically in modern times. It's important to retain some humility about the evolution of facts. I mean, I think today's censorship is, in effect, the modern equivalent of Galileo's house arrest. Thirdly, fact-checking and censorship often tends to focus in on particular areas that are considered to be of political importance, but they also reflect the political and ideological bias of the fact-checking industry. So we see fact-checks about climate change, but we don't see fact-checks about the reality denying misinformation that men can get pregnant. Fourthly, the way that censorship works is not transparent. So Twitter is often called the modern public square, but in fact, it's more like a labyrinth. The lights are off and the walls are moving. If your visibility is filtered, i.e. your post or your account is not seen by as many people as it should be because it's been artificially manipulated by algorithms or moderators.
Quickly with the fifth, because we've got to get to everyone else.
Basically, the best way to deal with misinformation is with more information, but also inoculating people about the techniques.
Okay.
I've just written a book about this, Free Your Mind. You can teach people to spot nudges propaganda.
All right, here we are.
All right, Laura, it's all very interesting. I don't counter every single one before I move, but just generally your response.
Yeah. Where we've got to be careful is when governments have counter-disinformation strategies. The USA's one blew up in its face, but as someone who has dabbled in the world of trying to do journalism about disinfo, one of the first things that happens to you is that they come for you. Yeah. They come to take you down with as much disinfo as they can. So when that happened to me, I was looking at who can help me, and ultimately, as a person in civil society, who can help being overwhelmed by slander because you've dared to challenge someone's right to spread propaganda and disinfo about massacres in Ukraine, is the only people who can help you is governments. But our government, its disinformation strategy is almost secret. We don't know what it is. I want it all out there in a democratic, participative counter-disinfo strategy, rather than either in secret or hand it all over to the corporates.
Kate, where are you?
Oh, I'm sorry to be annoying. I am somewhat on the fence. I'm sympathetic to wanting to defend free speech, and who polices the police in that sense. That is a good point that needs to be explored, and it probably has been overzealously enforced in COVID times or whatever. The other thing I strongly believe, and which Twitter would, I think, kind of ruins, is that facts exist, objective facts exist. And some people think that's not true. Well, I'm a believer in facts.
Yes, I mean, isn't that the problem? The truth of people and getting to
and
facts.
There is a truth, often.
Right. I mean, and that is becoming harder to persuade people about. Whose truth are we talking about? What facts? I presume you have difficulty on a daily basis talking about some of the issues as politicians.
Oh, gosh, absolutely. I mean, I don't know about you, but I know I certainly do. I mean, we obviously, I mean, I assume we're on the same page that we, you know, respect like the democratic right to free speech. That is an imperative. But as politicians, we know that the sort of information that gets put out about us that simply isn't true, it's very difficult to counter it. But one of the things I'm really concerned about, especially in the run-up to a general election, are some of the fake things that are being spread.
Absolutely.
You know, if we look at for example, that ridiculous recording of Keir, it's his voice sounded so realistic. But I know Keir, he would never have said those things. And in a run-up to an election where we need people to be building trust in their political parties, in our ability to govern for them and support them in their daily lives, we have to make sure that there is a greater responsibility, I think, for media companies and like social media companies to get the facts right. And the fact that Elon Musk has got rid of his moderators is deeply concerning, because I've had so many Islamophobic attacks and memes and disinformation spread about me that then gets sort of perpetuated, and there's no challenging that.
Right, but what can people do? I mean, they believe conspiracy theories, as we call them, because there is a feeling that information sometimes is being held back. COVID was a very difficult time. And if there is this sense that people feel, I'm not being told the whole story, then you are so much more susceptible to the idea of alternative theories.
Absolutely. Conspiracy theories about the vaccine. I mean, I'm daily getting people now saying all these excess deaths is entirely due to the vaccine, there's a big cover-up and the whole trust thing there. Absolutely, of course we agree with free speech, but free speech is not the same as false speech. And because social media companies make it so easy, they are so powerful, the platforms for information and disinformation to go around the world in a nanosecond, they have responsibilities. So the government needs to regulate what can legitimately be put on legitimate platforms, and those platforms have an absolute responsibility to make sure they are vetting and moderating what goes out, whether it's harms against children, whether it's sexual aggression stuff, or whether it's false information about this. And because of AI, this is a huge challenge, where that false information is actually coming out of the mouth of somebody who appears to be Keir Starmer or whoever, but is a chatbot-generated AI image. We have got to make sure there is a place to go for a reliable view. Is that true or not? And if it's not true, why has it not been taken down? And who do I complain to if I'm being fed these lies as truth?
That's the key, because you worry that if you call it out, you're then drawing more attention to it.
Well, that's the other thing. You can give
and
oxygen
yourself.
to these things, can't you?
Exactly.
Go on, Paul.
No, I think we've got the online safety bill. It's not primarily about disinformation, but it is about hate speech. It is about all forms of harmful content. And therefore, we've established, as the European Union also has, a completely different information regime than the one that's destroying American democracy right now. And I think the signatories of this letter, no matter how well-intentioned, have to bear in mind that I think the proof is in the pudding. British democracy will survive the onslaught and tsunami of disinfo. American democracy has a good chance of going under, because First Amendment allows you, put it this way, First Amendment allows you to call for genocide. The Second Amendment allows you to carry a gun while bearing a T-shirt, telling people what you're going to do. That's not the kind of society most of us want to live in.
Kate?
I'm not sure what to say after
No,
that.
well, you don't have to say anything.
I'm sorry.
Laura Dosworth, thank you very much for joining us to discuss all of that. It might be a bit early in
a bit
the day,
dystopian,
but
yeah.
we're going to move on to the Westminster drinking culture, blamed for bad behaviour. Oh, God, says Tim Lawton. The findings were based on 30 investigations by the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme between 2021 and 2022. Is drinking, or the culture of drinking at Westminster, to blame for MPs' bad behaviour when it occurs? Tim?
In some cases it has. Look, I've been an MP for almost 27 years, probably far too long, and some of the abuse of drink during the daytime, carrying on with your job in those early days, was on a different level. I think things have changed significantly. The trouble is, when you are working in an office and you're working long and unsociable hours. So last night we had 17 votes in a row into the evening. Then, if you take away all the bars and the catering and everything else to go with it, then we can't go out of the place to go down to the pub after work with workmates as you would in an ordinary job. But there are some people who, I'm afraid, don't get it. Remember, I've seen today account of how much money was spent in bars on wine and on spirits or whatever. There are 650 MPs and 780 members of the House of Lords. I think there are something like 15,000 people who work on the estate of the Palace of Westminster who have access to all the bars and catering. So we are a tiny, tiny part of that,
yes.
And yet we are blamed for all of the problems that go on. There are some people who clearly...
You're high profile and representative of course. I mean,
and need live to a very high standard. We expect our constituents and everybody else to do it as well. And so some people have let everybody else down, but it is not the norm. It's a small number, and they are gradually, I think, making it more and more difficult to do that.
Should we, Kate, rethink about letting MPs drink in the workplace, or no?
No, OK, fine. Look, I'm going to come out in defence of the pubs at Westminster. I think it's ridiculous. Like, people who behave badly, whether that's sexually inappropriate behaviour, groping, bullying, whatever it might be, they are grown adults. We're talking about MPs who know better or should know better, and it's their behaviour and they should take responsibility for that behaviour, and you can't just blame that on the drink. It's true that most people behave well. Those people that behave badly behave very badly and should take responsibility for that, and don't just blame, oh, at 8 o'clock I had a pint and I got carried away. The rest of us don't do that.
Right. Well, I mean, Rosanna, what's your experience?
Well, I'd say the majority of people that go and drink in the bars in the House of Commons are people who work incredibly hard throughout the day, are people who just want to enjoy a beverage at the end of their working day. I regularly get called to all sorts of medical things in the House, and I was once called to a bar brawl.
Is there a doctor in the House?
Honestly, I get calls from all sides. Rosanna, can you come? And once I got called to come to a situation where someone had a glass in their face. But what I would say is I agree that if you are going to be handsy, if you're going to be inappropriate, if you are not a decent person who is going to commit acts of sexual assault, for example, drinking in Parliament isn't going to suddenly make you do that. You are either predisposed to being a nasty person or you're not.
Right. I mean, just before I come to you, Paul, on that point, let's just look inside the House of Commons chamber there, which is filling up with questions just before Prime Minister's questions with Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer. Yeah, what's your response? I mean, this idea that perhaps drinking should be banned altogether, no alcohol on the Palace of Westminster, I mean, it's probably not realistic, but is that what it would take?
I don't work there. I've never had a lobby pass. I can probably count on the fingers of 2 hands the number of drinks I've ever had in Parliament. So I'm not the ideal person to say this, but what I've noticed is
Not a very good journalist, then.
Have you survived all these years?
The Parliament is, like it used to be, only a bit less. But the workplace, especially the corporate workplace, the office workplace, the City of London or the university, is very different. Both in terms of the gender dynamics, in terms of what you can say in joke to each other, and certainly the idea that anybody in any workplace would ever touch somebody inappropriately. It's an instant dismiss in the corporate world. And the idea that MPs think, oh, can I avoid it tonight? I am a bit disappointed by that. I think the culture has to calm down and professionalise.
Okay.
I think the idea of closing funds is fundamentally pretty puritanical. And having been a previous court reporter who did many an employment tribunal in Kingsway, I'd have to say that's not my understanding of how the city still operates.
Yeah, it's mine.
I mean, I think
In the workplace.
But is it also the case that people are a bit more confident about reporting some of these things? I understand you actually witnessed either the result of a fight that had gone up, but actually that we are hearing a bit more about it.
I think it's essential. I think we need to empower people to report it, because that is the way in which it will be cut down. Look, at the end of the day, we want it to stop. Whatever means that is, if that means that people are empowered to report it so that people are less likely to do it, that's a good thing.
Right. I mean, changing behaviour isn't easy. Is there a sense that in the Palace of Westminster there are, not you, of course, Tim, but MPs who've been in the House for decades and perhaps haven't quite caught up, perhaps, with how one does behave at work at all times?
Although, interestingly, some of the people who have been hauled up are relatively newer members as well. I think the whole culture has changed hugely. It's been called out a lot more. People are now, it's now easier to call it out, the various complaints procedures. And let's face it, if you are drinking in a bar, other than if Paul's there, there are journalists all around you and other people from other opposition parties who might take advantage of the fact that you're a bit worse for the wear and did something inappropriate. So it's the worst place to be letting yourself go and letting yourself down and letting Parliament down.
I'm just going to interject because I saw David Linden, the SNP MP, he was here with me in the studio yesterday, stand up and ask a question. And Kate, they were cheering the Conservative MPs just a little earlier, I was told, because Lisa Cameron, the SNP MP, has defected, of course, and crossed the floor over to the Conservatives. This, obviously, in the wake of the SNP leaders' conference. I think we can go inside the chamber.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House will have been shocked by the scenes at El Ahly Hospital. As my honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has said, we are working independently and with our allies to find out what has happened. I'm sure that honourable members will be raising further questions with me during today's session. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Law. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I associate myself and the whole of my party here with the horrors and unfolding tragedy of the bombing last night in Gaza of the hospital. Mr. Speaker, the Rafah border crossing from besieged Gaza into Egypt has been hit by several Israeli airstrikes, causing absolute terror for those who urgently need this crossing open to escape. Nadia El Nakla, an elected councillor in my city of Dundee and the wife of Scotland's First Minister, has had to take calls from her parents, Elizabeth and Majid, who, like all others trapped in Gaza, have been describing the horrors of death and indiscriminate killings everywhere. Members of her family were hit yesterday by a rocket from a drone, and Nadia's mother was saying her final goodbyes this morning, adding, "Last night was the end for me. Better if my heart stops, and then I'll be at peace. I can't take another night." Mr. Speaker, with military action intensifying and the death toll rapidly rising, the Prime Minister's first responsibility must be to bring British citizens home. So can the Prime Minister please give his personal assurances that every single step has been taken to open the Rafah crossing for both humanitarian aid and for UK nationals like Nadia's family to flee?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, the thoughts of everyone in this House will be with those families affected by what is happening in Israel and in Gaza, and I can give the honourable gentleman that assurance that we are doing everything in our power to ensure the safety of British nationals that are caught up in all of this, including my calls with leaders across the region, particularly around opening the Rafah border crossing, which is why I prioritised talking to President Sisi last week, and we continue to have dialogue both with the Israelis and the Egyptians about the Rafah crossing.
Mr.
Speaker, I'm proud to live in the most successful multiracial democracy in the world. But it saddens me, and I think it shames this whole House, that British Jews have been subject to such vile abuse and hatred in recent days. Anti-Semitism and all hate crimes, they fly in the face of British values. And we should not allow events abroad, no matter how horrific they are, to be used to sow seeds of division in our own country. So, whilst I welcome all the actions that my right honourable friend is taking to fight hate crime, to bring people together, may I ask him to consider urgently an immediate and specific policy of revoking the visas of any foreign national that commits an act of anti-Semitism or any other hate crime.
Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with my right honourable friend, who himself has done so much over the years to fight anti-Semitism. The increase in incidents we've seen over the past week is utterly sickening, and this government will do whatever it takes to keep our Jewish community safe. That's why we've provided an additional £3 million of funding to support the Community Security Trust, and we are working with the police to ensure that hate crime and the glorification of terror is met with the full force of the law. Under our existing immigration rules, we do have the power to cancel a person's presence in the UK if it is not conducive to the public good. Mr. Speaker, we will not tolerate this hatred, not in our country, not in this century.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by warmly welcoming the new member for Rutherglen and Hamilton West? Mr. Speaker, the news last night of hundreds killed at the Baptist Hospital in Gaza is incredibly distressing. But it's much worse for the people of Gaza. Their fear that there's no place of safety is profound. International law must be upheld, and that means hospitals and civilian lives must be protected. Last night, the Foreign Secretary said the UK will work with our allies to find out what has happened. I know this only happened last night, but can the Prime Minister please tell us when he thinks he might be able to update the House on progress with that work?
I know the whole House will have been shocked by the scenes at Al-Ali Hospital. Any loss of innocent life is a dreadful tragedy, and everyone will be thinking both of those who have lost their lives and the families that they leave behind. We should not rush to judgment before we have all the facts on this awful situation. Every member will know that the words we say here have an impact beyond this House. This morning, I met with the National Security Advisor, but also the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. I could tell the honourable gentleman our intelligence services have been rapidly analysing the evidence to independently establish the facts. We are not in a position at this point to say more than that, but I can tell him we are working at pace, but also cooperating and collaborating with our allies on this issue as we look to get to the bottom of the situation, and we will also continue all our efforts to get humanitarian aid into the region.
Yes, Tom.
I thank the Prime Minister for his answer. The terrible news last night came as we are still mourning the terrorist attack on Israel last week. Jews taken hostage, mutilated, slaughtered. And yesterday I met the families of some of the British hostages held by Hamas. Every minute of every hour of every day, they hope for good news, but fear the worst. They know the lives of their loved ones are in the hands of murderers. It's unimaginable agony. Israel has a right, a duty, to defend itself from Hamas, keep its people safe, and bring hostages home. But isn't it clear that if Hamas had a single concern for human life, a single concern for the safety of the Palestinian people, then they would never have taken these hostages, and they should release them immediately?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is important consistently for us to remember that Israel has suffered a shockingly brutal terrorist attack, and it is Hamas and Hamas alone that is responsible for this conflict. Our thoughts are rightly with those who have been taken hostage and their families. The distress they are feeling will be unimaginable for all those affected. I will be meeting with some of the families and offering them all the support of the British government to get their relatives home. We are working around the clock with our partners and allies to secure their freedom. And importantly, in amongst my other regional calls, I spoke specifically with the Emir of Qatar yesterday on this very issue, which we discussed at length. The Qatari government is taking a lead and working intensely to help release hostages using their contacts in the region, and we are working very closely with them to ensure the safe return of the British hostages.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I also met charities with staff working in Gaza and heard their accounts of the harrowing humanitarian crisis. Children fleeing their homes, hospitals barely able to function. The lights are going out, and the innocent civilians of Gaza are terrified that they will die in the darkness, out of sight. International law must always be followed. Hamas are not the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian people are not Hamas. Does he agree that medicines, food, fuel and water must get into Gaza immediately? This is an urgent situation, and innocent Palestinians need to know that the world is not just simply watching, but acting to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe.
Mr. Speaker, as I said on Monday, an acute humanitarian crisis is unfolding to which we must respond. It is right that we support the Palestinian people because they are victims of Hamas too. And that is why we have provided a further £10 million in humanitarian aid for people in the region. And we are working through preemptively moving aid and relief teams to Egypt, specifically to the El Arish airfield. We are working with local partners like the Egyptian Red Crescent and the United Nations primarily, and deploying Navy assets to the region, as well as exploring how we can support logistical requirements. And I've also raised this issue of humanitarian access in all of my conversations as a priority with every leader in the region, and we will continue working with them to get aid to where it is needed as quickly as possible.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has already been alluded to, since Hamas's terrorist attack, our country has seen a disgusting rise in anti-Semitism. Jewish businesses attacked, Jewish schools marked with red paint, and Jewish families hiding who they are. And we've seen an appalling surge in Islamophobia, racist graffiti, mosques forced to ramp up security, British Muslims and Palestinians spoken to as if they were terrorists. Does he agree with me that every member of this House has a duty to work in their constituency and across the country to say no to this hate and to ensure every British Jew and every British Muslim knows that they can live their life free from fear and free from discrimination here in their own country?
Mr. Speaker, all of us in this House can play our part in stamping out those who seek to cause division and hate in our society. We will make sure that we continue funding, as I said, the Community Security Trust, but also the equivalent protective security grant to protect mosques and other places of worship for the Islamic community in the UK. That funding was increased earlier this year. We will also remain in dialogue with the police to make sure that they are aware of the full tools at their disposal to arrest those who perpetrate hate crimes, incite racial or other religious violence. There is no place for that in our society, and I know this House will stand united in making sure that those who do this face the full force of the law.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do not want this conflict to harm us here at home, and we do not want it to escalate in the Middle East, where there has been too much bloodshed, too much darkness for too long. A two-state solution, a Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel, feels more distant than ever, but it remains the only way through. Does the Prime Minister agree that because hope is at its thinnest, we must work our hardest to ensure the voices of division and despair are sidelined, and that, however difficult it seems, the hope of a political path to peace is maintained?
Mr. Speaker, it is precisely because it is that vision of a more hopeful, peaceful future that Hamas tried to destroy that we must redouble our efforts to try and bring that future about. And all our conversations that both myself and the Foreign Secretary have had with regional leaders, we've emphasised our commitment to making sure that we make progress on all the avenues that will lead towards that peaceful future, and that has been a feature of both mine and the Foreign Secretary's dialogue, and I'm confident that there is willingness in the region not to escalate this crisis beyond dealing with Hamas, the terrorist organisation, but also to strive very hard to a future where Palestinians and Israelis can coexist peacefully, side by side, and look forward to a future filled with dignity, security and prosperity.
Keir Starmer.
This is a crisis where lives hang in the balance. and where the enemies of peace and democracy would like nothing more than for us to become divided and to abandon our values. Does the Prime Minister agree that during this grave crisis, this House must strive to speak with one voice in condemnation of terror, in support of Israel's right to self-defence, and for the dignity of all human life that cannot be protected without humanitarian access to those suffering in Gaza and the constant maintenance of the rule of international law?
Mr. Speaker, I agree. We will in this House speak with one voice in condemning Hamas for perpetrating a shockingly brutal terrorist attack and causing untold suffering on many. And as the Honourable Gentleman said, we stand united in supporting Israel's right to defend itself, to protect its people, and to act against terrorism. Unlike Hamas, the Israeli president has made it very clear that their armed forces will operate in accordance with international law, and we will continue to urge the Israelis to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians, whilst remembering, importantly in this House, that it is Hamas that is cruelly embedding itself in civilian populations.
Andy Carter.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate myself with the words of the Prime Minister, and can I commend the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary for the work they're doing to find a peaceful settlement in the Middle East. Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the Prime Minister's decision to provide £12 billion worth of funding for east-west high-speed rail lines between Manchester and Liverpool, and his focus on great northern towns as well as cities in the north. Will the Prime Minister ensure that towns like Warrington benefit fully from this rail upgrade, and that a hub station at Warrington Bank Quay, linking Northern Powerhouse Rail to the West Coast Main Line, remains a key part of the Network North?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his continued campaign to improve rail services in Warrington, and he's right. We will be investing £12 billion to better connect Manchester and Liverpool. This would allow for the delivery of Northern Powerhouse Rail exactly as previously planned, including high-speed lines, which would provide better rail connections for the people living in northern towns like Warrington. And I know that he'll be discussing this further when he meets with the Rail Minister.
MP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all continue to unequivocally condemn the abhorrent terrorist attack on the Jewish people and the Israeli state. We fully support the defeat of Hamas and, of course, the safe return of all hostages who have been taken. So too, I hope, do we all share the same common humanity of protecting civilians and condemning any acts of collective punishment against the Palestinian people. In that regard, many of the images emanating from Gaza in recent days will shock us all to the core. So can I ask the Prime Minister, will he join with us on these benches and call for an immediate ceasefire in the region?
Mr. Speaker, we believe that Israel does have a right to defend itself, to protect its people, and to act against terrorism and ensure that the awful attack that we've seen from Hamas cannot happen again. And unlike Hamas, the Israelis, including the President, have made it clear that their armed forces will operate in accordance with international law. And we will continue to urge the Israelis to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, my ask for a ceasefire is done with all sincerity to protect civilians, but also to ensure that we have the safe creation of humanitarian corridors. Humanitarian corridors which will allow for food, for water and for vital medicines to get into Gaza, but also for innocent civilians caught up in this terrible conflict to flee. In respect of those who wish to flee, can I ask the Prime Minister what early consideration, if any, his government has given to the creation of a refugee resettlement scheme akin to that previously put in place for Syrian nationals, Afghani nationals and, of course, Ukrainian nationals?
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that we are already one of the most significant contributors to the United Nations efforts to support Palestinian refugees, and our funding supports around 5.8 million refugees annually. And on Monday we announced a significant increase in our funding of aid to the region, including to the UN to support refugees. With regard to humanitarian aid, as I said before, we are already working through preemptively moving aid and relief teams into the region, but critically the most important thing is to open up access for that aid to get into Gaza, which is why our conversations with the Egyptians and others are so critical. We continue to work closely with allies to find every way to get that aid to the people who need it as quickly as possible.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night, sections of the British media were reporting as fact that it was Israeli rockets that had landed and attacked the Al-Ali hospital, relying on information supplied by officials in terrorist-controlled Gaza. The headlines have since been rewritten, but the outpouring of Jew hate on social media overnight was vile. So would the Prime Minister please make the point again that the way that this conflict is being reported has massive implications for our Jewish community, and that any information coming from Hamas must be treated with a degree of scrutiny and cross-examination that is sadly sometimes lacking.
Can I commend my right honourable friend for his excellent intervention? He is absolutely right that we should not rush to judgment before we have all the facts on the appalling situation that we saw yesterday, particularly given the sensitivities that he raises, the impact on communities here, but also across the region. And as I said, it is incumbent on all of those in positions of responsibility in this House and outside in the media to recognise that the words we say will have an impact, and we should be careful with them. We are working with our allies to establish the truth of what has happened. We will do that robustly and independently, but he's right to point out, in the same way as that we don't treat what comes out of the Kremlin as the gospel truth, we should not do the same with Hamas.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate my party with the comments in relation to the deplorable loss of human life, of innocent life in both Israel and in Gaza? Mr. Speaker, having left the European Union, building links and cooperation across the four nations of our United Kingdom can only strengthen the Union. Will the Prime Minister agree with my proposal for the creation of an East-West Council to bring together all parts of the UK family to discuss and collaborate on the trading and many other opportunities presented by the Union?
Can I say, I think the right honourable gentleman made a powerful case in his conference speech last weekend for a strong, functioning Northern Ireland within our union. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has had the opportunity to discuss our shared commitment to the union with his party over recent weeks and months, and I'm grateful for the constructive approach and tone taken in those discussions. I think there is considerable merit in the idea of a new East-West Council to further strengthen the union, and I look forward to exploring the issue with him and his colleagues further.
Martin Bickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following my right honourable friend's decision to reallocate funding from HS2, can I urge him to consider a number of projects that will boost the economy and improve the quality of life for my constituents and for northern Lincolnshire? In order to improve access to the free ports of the Humber, we need dualling of the A15 between Lincoln and the A180. And it is the A180 in particular that causes no end of problems for residents in nearby villages because of the concrete surface. Can I urge him to deal with resurfacing? And finally, Mr. Speaker...
Finally, I'd say I think the AA Atlas has been run out. Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friend has been a long-standing champion for Cleethorpes, and in particular the importance of strong regional transport connections. Network North will see Hull fully connected to the Northern Powerhouse network, which I know he'll welcome, and also North East Lincolnshire will share in a brand new £2.5 billion fund to support local transport connections, perhaps many or some of the ones that he mentioned. But I know he will also have been delighted to see LNER run a test service to Cleethorpes earlier this year, and I can assure him that DFT are continuing work to see a direct service to London reinstated.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members from the party opposite have said the way to fix the economic crisis that they have caused is to cut state spending by $200 billion and to freeze NHS budget. When will the Prime Minister stand up to the extremists in his party and condemn these ideas?
Well, Mr. Speaker, weeks after becoming Prime Minister, we announced a significant increase of almost £14 billion for the NHS and social care. We followed that up with the first long-term workforce plan in the NHS's history to ensure that we train the doctors and nurses we need for the future. That demonstrates our commitment to the NHS, and we also, I'm pleased to say, reached a settlement with over 1 million NHS workers, including our nurses, for a full, a fair and affordable pay rise.
So Desmond Swing.
Aid poured into Gaza in 2005 when Israel withdrew. Enlightened governance could have made a success of it. It is Hamas that has turned it into hell, hasn't it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know this is a subject on which my right honourable friend speaks with authority, and I thank him for his previous work in the area. What I can say to him is, with regard to our aid funding, as the Foreign Secretary will outline later, we have very stringent governance in place to make sure that it's spent on the humanitarian needs which we want to address. But also, I agree with him, there is one person and one person alone that is responsible for the atrocities that we're seeing, and that is Hamas.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, may I associate myself and my party with all those comments that have talked about the protection of innocent civilians today, wherever they may be. A whole wing of Seton Hospital in Devon is earmarked for demolition under this government. The proposal to demolish this wing is an insult to the communities who raised millions of pounds to help fund the upkeep of services at that hospital. The space was given to NHS Property Services, but thanks to the charging policy introduced by the Conservatives, that company is demanding £300,000 in rent. Will the PM let the NHS Property Services hand over the space to health charities and community interest groups so that we can stop a wrecking ball going through Seton Hospital?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman knows, decisions about hospital infrastructure are a matter for the NHS. I'm told that Devon Integrated Care Board are working together with NHS Property Services and local community healthcare providers to establish a future sustainable use for the currently vacant space. And may I also, Mr. Speaker, take the opportunity to commend the work that my honourable friend, the member for East Devon, is doing on this topic too.
Mark Eastwell.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the Prime Minister on his commitment to improve transport links in the north. However, to ensure that a complete strategic approach to rail links is achieved across the region, it should include the much-needed upgrade to the Penistone line running from Huddersfield through my constituency in Sheffield to Sheffield. An upgrade which the member sat with me from Colne Valley and Penistone Stocksbridge would also like to see delivered. With that in mind, will my right honourable friend commit to including the Penistone line in the Network North plans?
My honourable friend is a fantastic campaigner for the Penistone line rail upgrade. I know that my honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, is conducting a corridor development study, given the new commitments to both Sheffield Leeds and Sheffield to Hull, and as part of that exercise will consider enhancing the service on the Huddersfield to Penistone and Sheffield line, and I know that my honourable friend will discuss this further when he meets the Rail Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Bristol South, around a third of children live in poverty, most of them in working households. It's about the same as in Tamworth, where the Conservative candidate for tomorrow's election made foul-mouthed comments about families struggling to make ends meet. This is his Conservative Party. Will he condemn that candidate's comments?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of our record supporting people with the cost of living. Thanks to the actions that we've taken, we've paid half of a typical family's energy bill last winter, frozen fuel duty, boosted the national living wage to record levels, and 8 million people across this country are now receiving direct cost of living payments worth £900. Whilst we're helping people with the cost of living, all Labour's ideas are costing them a fortune.
Mr. Speaker, you may notice that more ladies in the chamber today are wearing pink for breast cancer awareness. But roughly 15% of those with breast cancer are diagnosed with lobular cancer, a little-known strain that's harder to detect has worse outcomes and no dedicated treatment. I'm working with Dr. Susan McCarlis at the Lobular Moonshot Project to campaign for a dedicated research stream for lobular cancer. Will the Prime Minister meet with us to discuss this and how the government can help us save more lives from breast cancer?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for all her work in this area. Early diagnosis of cancer is key, and the NHS's Help Us Help You campaign is seeking to address the barriers deterring patients from accessing diagnosis and treatment. Thanks to treatments and faster detection, survival rates for breast cancer are now increasing, and last year more than 1 million scans were carried out, preventing an estimated 1,300 deaths from breast cancer. But this Breast Cancer Awareness Month, I encourage anyone who is invited to take up the offer of breast cancer screening.
Stuart Malcolm Macdonald.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the sadism of Hamas can only be condemned, and there's no question of Israel's right to defence and security. But international law is very clear, Mr. Speaker, that acting against international law in response to terrorism is unjustified. So in all of the packages that the Prime Minister has announced vis-à-vis humanitarian aid and the military package he announced last week, can he tell the House how the government will ensure that international law is adhered to beyond just statements from Israel's head of state?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he talked about military assets. Let me be crystal clear. The assets that we have moved into the region are not there in any combat capacity. They are there for two reasons. First and foremost, to provide surveillance to ensure that this crisis does not escalate and that arms aren't being sent to entities like Hezbollah. That's what our surveillance aircraft are currently doing, and indeed the next set of assets arriving this week will also help. But also, they are there to provide contingency support for humanitarian assistance as and when required in the coming days and weeks.
Speaker, on Sunday, Terence Carney, a 70-year-old Hartlepoolian, was murdered by an asylum seeker. The people are afraid and angry. Every week, my office is besieged by asylum seekers. My staff are intimidated by young men. The fact is, most of them are illegal migrants who should be expelled. My thoughts and sympathies are with Mr. Carney's family and friends, and all my constituents affected by this heinous crime. However, sympathy is not enough. They deserve action, and I am demanding it. Will the Prime Minister take action? Will he make sure enforcement is delivered? Will he ensure that people who have no right to be here are expelled? Enough is enough. I want these people out of Hartlepool now.
Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend knows, I'm unable to comment on cases which are currently before the court, but can I join her in expressing my sympathies to families affected? And I would like to reassure her that this government is doing everything we can to tackle illegal migration and the harm it causes by removing those with no right to be here in the UK. We have excellent, long-standing relationships to return people to many countries. We are returning thousands of people more this year than we have done in the past, and we will continue to use every avenue at our disposal to ensure that it is only this country and this government who decides who come here and not criminal gangs.
Gavin Newland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have all been horrified at events in Israel and Gaza, and it's right we condemn utterly the inhuman terrorism of Hamas. This should also be the case with any obscenities and war crimes carried out by the Israeli Defence Force. Both the UN and Medicines Sans Frontières have described the siege of Gaza and the withholding of water to its people as collective punishment, a war crime under the Geneva Convention. Yet this week, both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have supported Israel's right to do so. Why?
Quite simply put, Mr. Speaker, Israel suffered from a brutal terrorist attack at the hands of Hamas. And it is absolutely right that Israel does have a right to defend itself, to root out terrorism and ensure that such an act doesn't happen again. As their president has said, their military will operate within international law. But what the honourable gentleman failed to acknowledge, that it is Hamas that embeds themselves inside civilian populations, puts innocent civilians in harm's way, and he would do well to remember that.
Crispin Blunt.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend has been absolutely right. to lead the nation in reassuring the British Jewish community in the wake of the utterly appalling atrocity visited upon Israel and Jews on the 7th of October. My right honourable friend, I understand, will be travelling to the region, and he will see for himself the shock and trauma that is through the Israeli nation after this event. And that is shock and trauma that is also accompanied by a rage. And the enormous danger is that the Israeli reaction, led by a Prime Minister who will be held accountable for this failure of intelligence, is indeed amounting to a war crime, and that will not only be a crime, it will be a mistake. And I urge my right honourable friend, there is now no one better placed to urge restraint upon Israel to stay within the international rule of law and exercise restraint on behalf of us all.
Mr. Speaker, as a friend, we will always urge Israel to take every possible practical precaution to avoid harming civilians and indeed to act within international law, as their president has said that their armed forces will do, whilst recognising the incredible complexity and difficulty of the situation on the ground. And it does bear repeating, Hamas is a terrorist organisation that embeds themselves inside of civilian populations. It is something we always have to remember, and Israel is taking every practical possible step to avoid harming civilians, and we will do everything we can to provide humanitarian support to the area.
Rebecca Long-Bailey.
The Prime Minister will be delighted to know that nuclear veterans like my constituent's granddad John are starting to receive the medals he promised. But John is still not getting his full medical records. His blood tests from Christmas Island, which are crucial for claiming a war pension, are missing, and countless veterans report the same. So I asked the Prime Minister, as the MOD has admitted that it holds at least 150 files withheld from National Archives referring to blood test and other data, will he review those documents, report back to the House and hold a public inquiry into why medical record omissions have happened and on whose instruction?
Well, can I start by thanking all our veterans for their contribution to our safety and security. I'm delighted I was able to announce the new nuclear test medal last year, and it's starting to be received by many people, including the Honourable Lady's constituent. The Honourable Lady will know that I can't comment on ongoing litigation in respect to requests for health records. However, I can say that anyone can request copies of their own medical data by submitting a subject access request to the department, and if they are not satisfied with the processing of that request, they can make a formal complaint via the complaints process.
Mr. Speaker, we appear to be on a downward spiral in the Middle East, which is inevitably going to lead to a humanitarian crisis. The role of Egypt will be fantastically important. What can we in the wider international community do to help work with the Egyptians to ensure that refugees, legitimate refugees, coming onto Egyptian soil pose no threat to the Egyptian state and are not terrorists in disguise?
Good question. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises an excellent point about the concerns of the Egyptians with regard to that border, but I can tell him we have prioritised speaking with President Sisi and are in continued dialogue with our Egyptian partners to see what we can do to provide reassurances, get humanitarian aid to the region. We are currently working with local partners like the Egyptian Red Crescent and the UN on the ground. There will be a significant logistical challenge in stockpiling aid at the border and then moving it into Gaza, and I want to reassure my honourable friend and the whole House that is something that the Development Minister is actively engaged in as we speak, so that we can play a leading role in facilitating the provision of that aid.
This is the final question before the urgent question. Patricia Gibson.
Thank you.
There is one more question, but we're going to leave Prime Minister's questions there. Let me introduce our panel for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, Edward Arger, Justice Minister. For Labour, Lisa Nandy, the Shadow International Development Minister, and Henry Zeffman, Chief Political Correspondent for the BBC. Welcome to you all. It was a serious and sombre session of Prime Minister's questions, and that is hardly surprising, bearing in mind what is going on in Israel and in Gaza. There was a sense of unity between both the Prime Minister and the leader of the Labour Party, both reflecting on the hospital blast last night and the loss of life in Gaza, in that hospital right at the heart of the Gaza Strip. Keir Starmer pointed out very clearly that he wanted to see constant vigilance of international law and humanitarian aid for the Palestinians, and both he and Rishi Sunak were very keen to underline and emphasise the fact that Hamas, who committed the atrocities, the massacre in kibbutzim and communities in the south of Israel last weekend, that they are a terrorist organisation, to be separated from Palestinian civilians and innocent people in the Gaza Strip. The hostage taking, which so horrified the world, continues, and Keir Starmer said that he'd visited the families of many of the hostages. Rishi Sunak is about to do the same. And that the Prime Minister said we shouldn't rush to judgment on who was responsible for the attack last night because of claim and counterclaim. What did you make of the whole atmosphere, the mood, and what both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition said?
There's a parallel universe, Joe, where this is the first Prime Minister's questions back after a party conference season, a very political party conference season, because both parties are trying to line up their arguments for the general election, which we assume will come next year. In that parallel universe, you'd have had political argy-bargy about HS2, about all sorts of other things. And the mood was completely different, completely different. And we've seen since Hamas's actions in Israel, getting on for a couple of weeks ago now, that Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer broadly agree. In fact, more than broadly, they do agree on basically every element of this. And I think you saw that consensus between the two main front benches. There's some different views in Parliament, but consensus between those two front benches play out there. And I suspect that consensus will hold for a little while, and that makes for a particularly distinctive mood in the House of Commons of kind of unity, which we don't see a lot.
Right, and a lot of the MPs' questions were around this issue of humanitarian aid, de-escalating the situation. They're putting pressure on Egypt because there's a crossing from Egypt into the Gaza Strip that could be opened but isn't yet. There was also talk, though, about community tensions here and a desperate need to not let that spill over, as many people felt some of the demonstrations did last weekend in support of Palestinians. Is that becoming now a real fear and concern of MPs like you?
Well, I think it's very important that, as both Keir Starmer and as the Prime Minister said, tone is very important, language is important, and it's important that as a Parliament we all speak. We seek to speak with one voice, and I think you'll probably find in the coming moments, you'll find Lisa and I are largely speaking with the same voice on these issues. It's been just over a week since we saw on our screens those horrific events unfolding in southern Israel and the terrorist attack on innocent civilians, and we must call it what it is, a terrorist attack by Hamas on those civilians. And we see in our own communities, in our own country, the agony of that, but we also see the anxiety and the concern within our Muslim communities about what comes next and what it means for them. So it's absolutely vital, I think, that we seek to focus on what unites us in this country. And we've heard just now, in fact, from the Prime Minister again on the amount of money that is being put in to both support security for the Jewish communities in this country, but also for our Muslim communities. And therefore, what I would say is throughout this, the tone and the language really matters.
Just before I come to you, Lisa, on a point that was raised actually by Sajid Javid, former Home Secretary, who raised this issue of revoking the visas of any foreign national who commits a hate crime or anti-Semitism here in the UK. People might be wondering, does that not happen anyway?
Well, I think you heard there in the response the Prime Minister saying there is already a power for the government, for the Home Secretary, where someone's presence here, where they are not a UK citizen, is not conducive in the sense of the public interest of safety. That power already exists, and I think that was made clear by the Prime Minister's answer. It would be wrong to comment on any individual case or anything like that, but I think the Prime Minister was clear there that there are powers available to the Home Secretary in those sort of circumstances.
I mean, at least it was interesting hearing Keir Starmer, because there has been some criticism. We are going to talk, actually, to a former Labour councillor who has resigned because she doesn't feel that the language was quite right when it came to condemnation in that region, following, yes, the Hamas atrocities, but also what's been going on with the Israelis bombing in Gaza.
Well, I think this is an incredibly painful time for a lot of people in this country, and it's the same in the Labour movement as it is out in the country, actually. Keir and I met with the hostages, as you said, the families of the hostages yesterday, and it was incredibly difficult to see that raw emotion and pain and anxiety that they're feeling, just not even knowing the whereabouts or the safety of their loved ones right now, including Holocaust survivors who are being held somewhere in Gaza. It's just unthinkable. But we also met with the aid agencies who are working on the ground, who were talking to us about, they were playing us messages from people who were in Gaza, hospital doctors talking about having to power down for lack of fuel, turning off the incubators of newborn babies, and it's a very, very painful time for a lot of people in this country, and it's hard to see through that at the moment to see what the solution is. But I think it is right that we are all clear and have consistently been clear, as Keir has from the day that this atrocity was committed against Israel, that international law must apply and that humanitarian access is the overwhelming priority right now for every political party, for all of our international partners, because if we don't do something in the next 24 hours, drinking water has run out, medicine is running out, fuel has run out, and we can't stand by and let that happen. We've got to focus our minds on the immediate humanitarian emergency in front of us.
The headline in The Independent says Labour councillors quit in protest over Keir Starmer's Israel stance. One of them is an Oxford councillor, Shaista Aziz. You've been a councillor on Oxford Council since 2018. Shaista, why have you resigned from the Labour Party?
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me on. So I had to make a very difficult decision to stand down as a Labour councillor. This is a city I was born in. It's been a great honour for me to be elected as a Labour councillor. The reason I've done this is because of the rhetoric that came from the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, on national radio, where he was asked about, how Israel should respond to the terrorist atrocities that were carried out in Israel. And he said that it was okay for Israel to cut off gas, water, food and electricity to the population of Gaza. Now, that it contravenes international law. I'm a former aid worker of 15 years. I have worked across this region extensively. I've worked in Gaza. I've worked in those refugee camps that have been obliterated by the might of the Israeli military. It is deeply horrifying to have potentially a future Prime Minister of this country coming out with this type of rhetoric. It is not acceptable. It contravenes international law. And so I had no choice to resign alongside another colleague. And we did actually ask for clarification from our local national leadership. We didn't receive a response from them. We waited 48 hours and then we resigned.
Right. I don't know if you've heard what Keir Starmer has said today in Prime Minister's Questions and in the House of Commons, but he was very clear about constant vigilance of international law, about the critical importance of humanitarian aid for Palestinians. Palestinians, he said, who have nowhere else to go, and the harrowing crisis that is unfolding there. Does that satisfy you and reassure you in terms of where the Labour leader is on this crisis?
And it's not just the Labour leader, it's the government as well. The government and the opposition need to call for an immediate end of lethal force inside Gaza, disproportionate force, which is illegal under international law. They need to call for an immediate ceasefire. They need to call, which they have done now, for full aid access. And they also need to call for all parties to this conflict, all international actors, to work to create a viable Palestinian state where the Palestinian people can live in dignity and security alongside Israeli people who deserve the same dignity and the same respect, and to be able to live without fearing their children hostage. The rhetoric that's come from the government and the opposition has been appalling, and they need to do much better.
All right, Shaista Aziz, thank you very much. Let me just pick up with you, Henry Zeffman, because at the moment James Cleverly is answering an urgent question from his counterpart, the Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy. There is also an early day motion protecting civilians in Gaza and Israel. Calls for the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary urgently press all parties to agree to an immediate de-escalation and cessation of hostilities. A lot of the tone and language is around Israel's right to defend itself when Hamas, as they say, a terrorist organisation embedding itself in the civilian population, making it very difficult for Israel to root out Hamas without civilian casualties.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect, we'll ask them, but I suspect both front benches would agree with a lot of what the Councillor said there and what that early day motion, which I think about 30 Labour MPs have signed, says about de-escalation. But I think where they disagree is on the ceasefire, because it's kind of implicit in the government and Labour position that Israel has a right to defend itself, but by that they are supporting Israel's stated intention to take out Hamas. Now there is clearly going to be questions, operational and moral, going forwards about the extent of civilian harm that might be there because of the nature of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. But clearly that is the big contention here, is whether there should be a ceasefire or actually what both parties here are saying, which is that Israel does have a right to take military action of some sort in Gaza.
Well, Lisa?
Could I just say about Shaista, first of all, that I'm really sorry to lose her from the Labour Party. She's done a huge amount of work over the years, particularly about the representation of Muslim women at the highest levels in our movement, and it is I am really sorry to see her go. And on this issue about consistency about international law, we have been consistent actually from day one in saying that Israel and all parties must act in accordance with international law. It matters for safety and security of Israel and for the safety and security of the Palestinians, and we don't want to see any more civilians harmed. But on the issue of a ceasefire, you'll know that the UN has already called for one. There are serious practical issues which Ed and I were just talking about before we went live on air, about opening up the Rafah crossing, about whether you can find a way to actually deliver that aid through UNRWA, the UN organisation, or whether actually the Israelis deem that too risky at the moment because Hamas has been targeting UNRWA facilities. There's been a proposal around a safe zone, but that is very complicated. A lot of Palestinians fear that if they were to move south, that they wouldn't ever be allowed to return. And so there are serious, complicated issues here, which is why we are being cautious about the language that we use, and we are trying to calm this situation down. Because if we don't get that access opened up and we don't get that aid to people in the next 36 hours, there will be very serious consequences.
And of course, we'll be following all the developments as they happen and unfold. In the House, that debate is continuing. I would like to draw your attention, because you're a Justice Minister, to the issue that we discussed actually earlier in the week. BBC News, low-level offenders could be released early under jail reforms. Now, this is because of a major overcrowding crisis that has seen judges delay putting serious criminals behind bars. How's it got to this stage, Edward?
Well, there's a number of points. In terms of where we are now, we've got about 88,000 people in our prisons, which is pretty near the capacity of them.
About 500 places away, apparently.
There are a number of factors that have created that pressure, but one of the most significant is the fact that in 2019, before the pandemic, we had about 9,000 people in prison on remand. It's now 15,000. That's an extra 6,000 people occupying prison cells because they are remanded there while awaiting trial.
Yeah.
And the reasons for that are twofold. One of them is it's the COVID backlog, because we didn't abandon jury trials, which means there is still a backlog there. And the second one is, of course, exacerbated by the bar strike.
Right. Well, Lisa, I mean, does that satisfy and reassure you?
Not really. I mean, it does seem quite extraordinary that at this moment you've got a government that can't even do the very basics of keeping people in prison and keeping people safe. It feels like another symbol, like the collapsing schools, like the hospital waiting lists, of a government that's just given up on governing.
Right. I mean, Lisa, is Labour planning to spend significant amounts of money to increase prison capacity?
Well, it isn't just about building more prisons. It's about dealing with the backlog in the courts, as Ed just acknowledged, and the fact that we've had such chaos in the court system over quite a long period of time. It's also about looking at the whole criminal justice system and, you know, taking a much more strategic view
Right, I mean, they're going to be full pretty well soon, aren't they? I mean, 500 places, not that many left. Is it right, though, to give offenders community orders when, on the other side of the fence, we've got ministers saying that we should take a much more serious look at people who are shoplifting, send more of them to... We haven't got the room.
So, 2 points. Firstly, in terms of the backlog, very quickly, that backlog in the courts was 48,000 in 2010, inherited from the previous government. We got that down to 40,000. Hang on, we got that down to 40,000 before the pandemic. That is the reason it's gone up again. So we do need to put that in context. But to your specific point, Joe, about short sentences for different offences, what the Lord Chancellor made very clear is that we are protecting the public by making sure those who commit the most serious offences, violent offences, sexual offences, will serve longer in prison. But we also know that if you serve a sentence of under 12 months, you are 58% more likely to reoffend. If you serve a suspended sentence with tough community penalties, you're 22% more likely to offend. So it does make a difference. It's about doing the right thing to protect the public and prevent crime and get people off that conveyor belt.
I think the problem, though, is that you're doing this in the context of not having got a grip on the justice system to the extent that you've got too many people in the prisons. If you were trying to start a debate about whether it's right or not for people to serve custodial sentences in any other context, I think people might be more willing to consider it, but just simply releasing people from prison or keeping people out of prison who you've already said should be there because you haven't got the space, I mean, that is really unacceptable. And particularly in the context, if you've got a Prime Minister and a Home Secretary who talk very tough about getting tough on the criminals, but you haven't got enough police on the streets to catch them, you haven't got any space to put them, and now you've got a Justice Secretary saying, well, we're just going to have to let them out.
And
it's just absurd.
Of this, it is, of course, exactly what Labour did in 2007. The difference being with what we're doing in terms of the release is we are putting tough conditions around it, curfews, electronic monitoring, which weren't there when Labour did it in 2007, which means one slip, they breach those rules, they breach that licence, they're back in and they will hear that prison door clang again for the rest of their sentence. That's the difference.
None of that helps you, though, with the fact that you've said that these people should be in prison. You've said that you're going to get tough on people who commit crimes.
These are people who are due to be released automatically.
Because you can't get
these are
people
who are due to be released automatically anyway. They will be released 18 days earlier with tough conditions and licence conditions as they reintegrate back into the community 18 days earlier.
I'll be honest with you,
point.
Ed, and I have a lot of respect for you, but it doesn't cut it with me, and I think the bigger problem you're going to have is that I don't think that will cut it with the public as well.
I mean, all right, well, I mean, how big a political issue is this now and going to be ahead of the election?
I think crime in general is definitely going to be a big part of the general election. And I think that argument that you just heard there, that we might have heard at PMQs if what was happening in Israel wasn't happening, I think that I can see that happening, in this studio during an election campaign. I think the difficulty for the government is there've been a lot of justice secretaries over the last 13 months. There've been a lot of justice secretaries over the last 13 months, and some of them believe that prison works, the famous Michael Howard mantra. Some of them are on the more liberal wing of the Conservative Party on that issue. I think Alex Chalk, the current Justice Secretary, is genuinely on that more liberal view of custodial sentencing, but only unveiling this policy in the context of a prison capacity problem, I think, makes it hard for the government to present it as a sort of broader reassessment of penal policy rather than just an attempt to deal with what is clearly a very urgent problem.
Let's talk about the by-elections broadly, because they are happening on Thursday night and we'll, of course, have a special overnight programme as people go to the polls in both Tamworth and Mid-Bedfordshire. So please do join me. I'll have a whole panel of guests for that special results programme on Thursday night at midnight on BBC One. Tell us the backdrop to these by-elections.
Well, actually, you've got to think back to Boris Johnson for understanding why both of these by-elections are happening. So Tamworth, the MP there previously was a man called Chris Pincher. He served various different jobs under Boris Johnson, but latterly Deputy Chief Whip, and allegations about his conduct at a sort of party were the final trigger for Boris Johnson's downfall. Though obviously there was a long background to it. And after a long period of him not being around Parliament, he ultimately resigned after a report into his conduct. Tamworth is one of the safest Conservative seats in the country. It was previously a Labour seat under Tony Blair, but nevertheless now a very safe Conservative seat. But Labour people I've been speaking to, not the ones who are sent out to manage expectations, but the ones who actually do sometimes speak candidly to me, they're pretty bullish bumped into someone earlier today in Parliament, and they were saying they really think they could win that seat. I think that would be extraordinary. The other by-election is Mid-Bedfordshire. Nadine Dorries, remember her, one of Boris Johnson's biggest supporters, and she resigned her seat eventually.
Yes, took a while.
Out of frustration that she didn't get a peerage that she believed Boris Johnson had promised her. And that, again, Labour are quite optimistic, but it's a bit of a more complicated seat because the Lib Dems also think they could win.
Right, so is that a sort of three-way fight then?
It is, and that is fascinating. But I don't think it will tell us as much as Tamworth about the general election as a result, because for various reasons to do with where the Liberal Democrats' support is these days, there aren't as many three-way marginal seats in the country as there have been in some previous general elections. So I don't think there's a lot of seats in the general election, whenever that comes, where that will look a lot like the competition we have in Mid-Bedfordshire. Both the Lib Dems and Labour are fighting it especially hard because it's a by-election. Whereas Tamworth, if Labour win that, there'll be, I can't remember how big your majority is, Ed, but there'll be a lot of Conservative MPs comparing their own majority to the Tamworth, the size of the former Conservative majority in Tamworth.
It's going to be a big night. Henry has built up their expectations of worth watching for what actually unfolds that evening. And thank you to my guests for joining us for this part of Politics Live. Otherwise, from all of us here, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.